So today I want to talk to you about the absolute beginning of BDSM. Like, what are the, say you are someone who knows absolutely nothing. What are the very first things that you need to know about BDSM? Well, let's just tackle that name. In some previous podcasts, I've tackled a little bit about the name with what is, the acronym means and some of the different theory behind it. But BDSM, it really splits into two things: bondage, discipline, and then it splits into another thing called sadism and masochism. We'll talk more about what all those things specifically are in just a moment, but those were the first two that came up was bondage and discipline. It kind of came together and collided with sadism and masochism. And later down the road, later in BDSM history, people realized that the D and the S in the center of BDSM also kind of stood for dominant and submissive, which are two of the identities that you find within BDSM. Two possible identities, although there are more. And so, BDSM. So, what's some of the historical origins of BDSM? Well, um, S&M and B&D, they're erotic practices, and and researchers, they've found examples of sadism and masochism as far as back as like the 6th century BCE. There was a burial site there in what is now a part of Italy, and there was an erotic depiction of two men striking a woman with a cane, and it was found inside a burial chamber. You can also find references within the yogic practice of the Kama Sutra, which was written between 400 BCE and 200 CE. And you find a lot of really explicit descriptions of different ways to strike your partner during sex. It tells you in there where to hit, and it even describes some of the joyful cries of pain that the strikes will evoke. And so, in that practice, in that yogic practice, or that practice of yoga, or one aspect of yoga, you'll find some of the SM part. And really, some historians really kind of propose that the S and M, as they're known today for sadism and masochism, really emerged as a form of sexual behavior at the beginning of the 18th century. Kind of when the time when medical professionals began categorizing human sexuality in a way to try to understand it. And you can find uh, some of these activities appearing in popular novels and literature, like a novel called Fanny Hill that was written in 1749. And as early as 1769, there's reports of London brothels that were specializing in flogging. And so, the terms sadism and masochism, they derive from the names of two uh, famous erotic writers and two authors, the Marquise de Sade and Leopold von Sacher-Masoch. Uh, uh, Sade's descriptions, they're kind of more like snuff stories. And modern and more like movies than our modern BDSM practices. Because his writings really didn't stress safety or informed consent. And um, Sacher-Masoch's novel Venus and Furs isn't as much about receiving pain. Uh, it's more so about a dominant submissive relationship, and in his story, the woman is the dominant. And so that's a little bit of the history. We see the BD practices of bondage and discipline really begin to shape and form uh, as men uh, were coming out of the military from World War II, and um, they were carrying over their some of those hierarchical military practices of rank and like military rank, like sergeants and captains and different people being above and below others. They and some of that protocol and discipline of that military style, they carried it into their sexual activities, and that's where we see the bondage, and where we see and bondage being like a mental practice more than, although it is very much about ropes and chains and those types of things and restraints. But in the terminology, bondage in the title of BDSM really more so stands for like a mental kind of bondage, like restraining, putting someone in their place. And then the discipline aspect of it, while there are some aspects of corporal punishment and rewards and those sorts of things, it stands for all of the service and the protocols that have to do with exchanging power in relationships, the dominant and submissive kinds of stuff. And so I know I'm using some words that you may not be 100% familiar with, but I'm trying to kind of, I will explain those a little more as we go on. Um, those who are into BDSM uh, for sexual purposes, uh, well, no, there are people that are in it for sexual purposes, and then people that are in it for what are somewhat like uh, more about psychological purposes. People that are looking for more of an imbalanced authority relationship, what we call a power exchange. Uh, they're looking to be submissive to someone or dominant over someone else. Those are two of the main reasons why people get involved. But when you form an intimate connection in doing SM or S&M sadomasochism type of play, you do so either as a bottom or a top. A bottom is the word that we use for someone who receives like pleasurable pain from a submissive, I mean from a sadist. Like they receive some kind of pleasurable pain, or they receive some kind of kink. And then we call the person who's giving some type of kink a top. And in any type of play scene that takes place, you may be the bottom in some aspects of things and the top in other kinds of things. And so you may do a little of both, or you may find yourself predominantly one or the other. And so BDSM is more complex and more intimate than what it's called vanilla sex. And so vanilla is just, it commonly refers to like a plain flavor, uh, where BDSM or kink is somewhat of a spiciness to your relationship. And so the vanilla being kind of a little bit bland, somewhat sweet, but a little bit of bland, and BDSM being very spicy. And so uh, now there are people who get involved in BDSM for, like I said, a variety of reasons. And BDSM, though, really, here's like your word of caution here. BDSM really, or the disclaimer, that's a better word. Here's the disclaimer: BDSM isn't for everyone. And we certainly think that it is good for most people who become involved in it, but it's not really for everyone. Sometimes people will become involved in BDSM and they just, for whatever reason, won't have a really great time, you know. Uh, and so they'll sometimes it has to do with their upbringing, their cultural or religious biases. Sometimes become kind of come up and become strong, and One thing to note is that some people get involved with it to deal with past traumas. And what that means is a lot of times they feel like if they are in control in a scene, in like a play scene, that they can experience some of the things that were once traumatic in their lives where they were powerless. Now they can experience them feeling powerful and consensual and in control. We will note that BDSM is never a replacement for professional therapy. And so, professional therapy and professional medicine, it all has its place in our lives. And we definitely think that, if you need some type of professional therapy, don't come to BDSM looking for that to be your therapy. It can certainly be somewhat therapeutic, but it's never a replacement for professional therapy. And so it's never a replacement for the types of medicines or medications that you may need. A lot of times, BDSM practices can amplify existing problems that are in your life. That BDSM relationships can amplify problems that existed in vanilla relationships. And so sometimes BDSM isn't necessarily the answer. Sometimes you need to get help elsewhere, and then explore when you've gotten a little bit of healing and a little bit of therapy, perhaps explore BDSM then. Um, what you'll discover about BDSM in general is that it involves lots of communication. And so if you have troubles with communication, troubles with being honest, troubles with giving your consent, with being honest with partners. If you have trouble communicating the things that you do and do not enjoy, then if you have problems communicating, BDSM may not be a good fit for you, because communication and trust are core elements of BDSM relationships. Um, to be in a successful BDSM relationship, they're based on clear and honest communication. And this is really important because a lot of the things that you do that are done in BDSM can be kind of edgy, and the trust between partners quiets the fear of new experiences and helps both the top and the bottom to emotionally release themselves and relax into the relationship dynamic or just simply their S&M play. And so, the internet, we talked a little bit about BDSM history, but then, BDSM started long before the internet even existed. And so when the internet popped up into our lives, it really did it was a it was a double-edged sword. The internet allowed people who were marginalized and disenfranchised, which were a lot of people involved in BDSM. It allowed them to connect together and to suddenly have more of a forum, more of a voice in our culture. But then, as well, it also um, allowed for people to become involved in BDSM that didn't have the history or the traditions that were generally passed from person to person within local communities. And so there also wasn't necessarily the accountability did not exist that once was. When you went to the same club and learned from the same types of people, that they began to know you and you had a rapport with that crowd. But with the internet, you could be anonymous and you could suddenly give yourself a title that you may not have earned. See, titles used to be earned in local communities, and now people were just giving them to themselves. And so, what they used to have was they used to just have a code of conduct that was uh, good for, that basic, were just basic principles like honesty and trust and integrity. And so they went from having a creed, local groups had creeds and codes of conduct. They went to a more universal thing that we see, uh, uh, mottos like safe, sane, and consensual, or risk aware consensual kink. These are two different mottos. One's called SSS, and the other one's called, SSC, safe, sane, and consensual. And the other one is called RAC, risk aware consensual kink. So these were, when the internet came around, they went from having local creeds to having these more universal mottos to help people be more safe, and to have uh, to kind of be something that everyone everywhere could adapt to their, as a motto, to how they were going to perform, or what things were acceptable within BDSM. There are a few things that are never acceptable in BDSM, and those are things that, or people or things that cannot give consent, are automatically off limits in BDSM. So you'll never have anything to do with anyone who's a minor, anyone who's a child, anyone who's outside a legal age of consent. You'll never have anything to do with those. Those people will never be a part of BDSM, because they cannot legally or morally or ethically give consent. And so minors are totally off limits, which is a good thing. Animals are completely off limits. You will not find anyone having any kind of sexual relationships with animals, because animals don't have a voice and they cannot give consent. They call that bestiality or bestiality. And then necrophilia is off limits. Dead people. Dead people can't give consent because they're dead. Also, people who are severely impaired, if they didn't give consent before the impairment, and if you are not in a long-term relationship with them, where you are aware or not if they have given continued consent throughout the practice. uh, just, it's almost a no-no. It's almost always a no-no that uh, severe intoxication, those people cannot give consent. So we don't do BDSM practices under severe intoxication. And so those are some of the types of things. If you can't give consent, then uh, then BDSM practices are automatically off limits. And so we kind of looked at, or said something just a couple minutes ago, about the difference between vanilla and BDSM. And vanilla sex is not necessarily limited to just like a missionary position or heterosexual intercourse. It includes anything you see in like standard gay or straight porn movies, like oral sex, anal sex, maybe the occasional, slapping an ass or two. Um, Vanilla sex can be lots of fun, and kinky people oftentimes incorporate vanilla sex practices into their types of play too. um, but vanilla, while it's not like a pejorative term, it's simply something that's descriptive of things that are not kinky. And so a lot of times we'll talk about something being vanilla, and we're not saying that in a bad way. We're just saying that that's a non-kinky thing. And so, obviously a lot of vanilla people like to spice up their sex occasionally. And so, um, they one of the things that really sets BDSM apart from vanilla is that they oftentimes don't incorporate S&M pain play, or uh, dom and sub power exchanges uh, into into the way that they do uh, sex, and the way that they do their relationship. Most vanilla relationships are what are called power neutral. means but all the persons involved in the sex, they maintain their personal autonomy at all times. And so that's just kind of a hallmark of most things that are vanilla, are power neutral dynamics. And so in BDSM, we generally add things like toys or tools like vibrators, dildos, floggers, canes, electrical gear, maybe needles, and all kinds of other things. We also generally add S&M techniques, which is like knowing where and how and in what order to use the types of equipment, including sometimes our hands or use the equipment, and sometimes including um, using that equipment on hands and genitals and feet and breasts, and it's knowing all the different places and how to give the pain in those places, the pleasurable pain. Um, it includes assumed roles, so which S&M play oftentimes may have some type of role play. It may have a very temporary within the play scene where somebody is like a teacher and student role play, a professor and student, an owner and pet, things like that. And then there are also psychological dynamics of what we call power exchange or authority transfer. Sometimes there's hypnosis or mental bondage or sensory deprivation, different types of techniques. And we'll talk more about those at another time in another podcast, obviously. And so, um, uh, BDSM play is between tops and bottoms. Tops being the people who are giving in a play scene. And the times when we play and get together are called scenes. We often call it scenes or scening. It is just like the, um, oftentimes we plan those out, how they're going to look, how they're going to go down, what the top is going to do, and what the bottom is going to receive. And there's nothing wrong with those uh, those titles, those temporary roles of top and bottom. There's nothing wrong with, sometimes people don't come into BDSM looking for any kinds of relationships, that we just sometimes want to play. And we sometimes want to just add kinky play to our sex or just kinky play to our lives. It doesn't necessarily have to do with sex. Like, it doesn't always have anything to do with penetration of any kind, but it's always adult and it's always somewhat erotic to a certain point. And so sometimes people just like the pain and don't have any kind of sexual touching. So it's between a top and a bottom. And then a lot of times the things that we use in our play, we sometimes call them toys, and other times we call them tools. Some people call the scenes uh, play scenes, and other ones call them that, or talk about how they are working over or working their bottoms. And so, bottoms being the people, not bottoms being the body parts. And so, um, but most of the time, we'll just use the word toys and play, meaning like the vibrators and floggers and paddles and whips and all of those kinds of things. And so, um, that's kind of just an overview right there. I think I may talk about one more thing. And so, um, there are different types of top and bottom roles. I'll just talk about two of them. There are what are called activity roles, and there are authority roles within play scenes now. So, in BDSM, activity roles are roles that are concerned with someone giving sensations or receiving sensations. And authority roles concern whether someone is giving orders or following orders. It's different than a dominant or a submissive relationship. It's a top and bottom. It's just within that scene. And so someone may be where kinks are involved, someone may be giving a paddling and someone is receiving a paddling, or someone may be having someone do a certain task and then the other person is doing the task. Someone may be uh, using another person as a piece of human furniture. Like someone may be the human footstool, and so one person is putting their feet up on the other person's back, the top, and the person who is the footstool is the bottom, and that is more of an authority role, where the activity role is like a paddling, and so um, sometimes people who find that they enjoy the authority roles in the top and bottom scenes, they sometimes like to look farther into having those types of relationships within BDSM, more authority transferring, power exchanging types of relationships. And so that's definitely something to consider. If if ordering someone around to do tasks or being ordered around to do tasks sounds exciting to you, that may be something to look forward to or look into down the road. Is to look into having BDSM not just be play scenes, but be part of your relationship and be both in and outside of the bedroom. Imagine that, having BDSM be both in a play scene and in your everyday life. It happens every day. I'm in one type of relationship like that where I'm the dominant and I have a submissive, and I am dominant 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. I am always dominant to her, and she is always my submissive in and out of the bedroom at all times. She submits to me, and uh, uh, we have a wonderful relationship together, a wonderful BDSM relationship, which is fulfilling for both of us. Fulfilling for me as asserting my dominance, and fulfilling for her, uh, giving and yielding her submission. And so BDSM has wonderful possibilities, and it can be wonderfully complex, but it can also be as simple as just play scenes together. And we'll talk more about some of about uh, the how tos as this podcast continues, but those are some of the real just basic things. We went over what BDSM means. I'll remind you one more time as we leave today: bondage and discipline. And it was collided, that bondage and discipline world collided with the S&M, sadomasochism world. Sadism and masochism, bondage and discipline, they came together. And then, like I said, later down the road, someone noticed that dominant and submissive kind of uh, was there in the middle. But it's not really 100% necessary to have that in there, because all of those types of things are included in the bondage and discipline. So, bondage and discipline world, sadism, masochism, they make up BDSM. I'm Primal Piggy. Thank you for uh, being on this podcast with me today. You can find me on Facebook at the Primal Piggy. You can also find us Whips, Chains, and Duct Tape, our large free BDSM educational page, over 120,000 or 112,000 followers. You can find that at WCDTBDSM, all those letters together, at Facebook. All right. Thank you very much. You have a wonderful day.